I just want to welcome all of you here. I'm just so delighted to be a part of such a beautiful community and to thank very, very vigorously my wonderful twin and his fabulous girlfriend Angela for their wonderful hosting and for this great setup that we have. We have some international sweets and flavors here from, we have some sweets from Mexico and some cookies from Carolina. And they've just really set up a wonderful atmosphere here and brought this great gathering together, and I'm really grateful to you both for that. And
remind you of anybody?
And of course I have some very dear friends of my own, my godparents, Lata and Nand, and some old friends and new, and I look forward to getting to know all of you. So I just want to tell you a little tiny little introduction. Since this is kind of an informal gathering, I'm just going to give you a very tiny introduction, a little overview of some of the main themes in the book, and then I thought I'd read a couple of passages and then we can have a little discussion if you guys are interested, and kind of talk about some of your own experiences with migration. And just to segue into that, the whole purpose for this book is the idea that migration is a universal experience, and really, if we want to understand one another better, we can come from a starting point where we all understand that we share certain basic experiences. Now, granted, the migration that takes one across several borders is very different from the migration that takes you from your parents' house to, say, your spouse's house or to your career. But the act of recreating oneself, the act of moving from one place to another and recreating oneself, trying to locate oneself in a continuum from the past into the future and from one society to the next is a universal and shared one. So what I wanted to do with this book was, first of all, challenge the idea that there is a conflict between the so-called Muslim world and the West, basically taking as my premise the fact that the so-called Muslim world is such an incredibly diverse and complex place. We're talking about a place where people are coming from some 32 different countries, and within that from several hundred different ethnicities and sub-nationalities and religious subsects, ways of practicing the religion, ways of relating the religion to everyday life. The way that the religion actually can dictate not just personal identity and personal faith, but actual social arrangements varies widely across the world. And then to take in contrast to that the fact that this so-called West is also such an incredibly diverse and complex place. For example, how much can we say that life in Belgium resembles life in the United States? Politically, socially, economically, and otherwise. So what I wanted to do was to take as my basic premise this idea of contrast, and to follow this by taking three different families from three very different backgrounds and circumstances, from different countries, from different socioeconomic circumstances, for different reasons for migrating. Some leave as a result of war, as forced migrants, and some are forced migrants as a result of economic marginalization, poverty, and strangulation, in search of opportunity. Or sometimes people leave making what they believe is a rational decision, but is actually solely an emotional decision. A desire to go someplace better, a desire to see something better, a desire to take a risk. For example, my parents probably could have had a reasonably good life in India, surrounded by family and taken care of by loved ones, but I believe that his heart, my father, was a risk taker, an adventurer, someone who believed that he could barter the safety and security of home for some grandiose vision of success. And in the end, he believed that he got that. However, there are many people who don't believe that. So this story, this book basically follows three different families. I have a Palestinian family from Jerusalem, migrating over the Gulf and ultimately into London. They come as high-class and high-skilled migrants. They are very wealthy. In fact, their home in Jerusalem is the current day Israeli labor court. So you can imagine that they were not impoverished to begin with. And they migrate to London. They now live in a three-story marble palace in Knightsbridge. For those of you who are familiar with London, that's not exactly the outskirts of town. And they have a very well-established life. My character however, doesn't find out that he's Palestinian until he's 11 years old. And he finds out that he's Palestinian not from his parents, but from the British media, from the coverage of the Intifada, which many of you would remember as the moment when the Palestinian struggle and Palestinian quest for nationhood became a part of the Western public consciousness. And as a result of this, he kind of constructs an identity for himself as a part of this struggle, and identifies himself not through family narrative and through connection to his parents, but identifies himself by reading, through documentaries, by research, by understanding who he is. And he kind of arranges his identity for himself. And he ultimately becomes kind of the founding figure for Arab identity, in Arab youth identity in London, becomes the founder of an organization called Arab Media Watch, which is a media monitoring and activist group, and becomes a semi-public figure. So from learning of his identity from the public, he then engages with his identity on a public level. And ultimately, he knows very little of his Palestinian past. He knows very little of the culture and of the identity. His life is very much London, very much British. But since he's created this identity in opposition, he kind of has a challenge. He struggles a lot with who he is. And he ultimately decides that he will feel much more at home if he goes back home to this place that he's never known. So his arc follows this act of constructing his identity as a Palestinian, and then ultimately trying to move back home to a land he's never known, and trying to figure out whether that actually is home. My other character is a Kurdish woman from the southeastern part of Turkey. Her father migrates as a guest worker to Germany. Germany set up a series of guest worker treaties after the end of the Second World War, when all of their men had gone off and died, taking over the rest of the world and taking over the rest of Europe. And so ultimately the country was lacking for people to rebuild it after the devastation of World War II. So they had several guest worker treaties, the most significant of which was with Turkey. And this was significant because Turkey ultimately had, at this point, a long-standing conflict between the citizens of its eastern part of the nation, which the Kurds identify as Kurdistan, and with the western part of the nation. So you saw this kind of mass migration from the Kurds, primarily being pushed out of their villages through economic strangulation into this rapidly industrializing West, being pushed out first into factories in that eastern part of the world, and then ultimately to ghettos in the cities, and then ultimately to Europe as guest workers. So we can surmise that a very large percentage of the population of Germany's Turks is actually Kurdish. So that was that first generation, and my character actually becomes a social worker. She becomes a feminist and an activist. She ultimately moves to Berlin to study, becoming the first person as a woman in her family to go to the university, when many of her relatives have never even had an elementary education. And she moves into this man-free lesbian commune and becomes a feminist radical, and really starts getting involved with Berlin's leftist scene, and ultimately falls in love and has to come to terms with the relationship between her personal ambition and her life. And her arc follows this relationship between the personal as political, and how to live one's identity through living out one's culture every day. She feels that she is making a push for Kurdish nationalism in the way that she makes tea, in the way that she invites people over for dinner, in the way that she loves, in the way that she lives, in the way that she forces every one of her friends to learn how to dance Kurdish style in a circle, and the fact that she speaks her language fluently. So her arc follows that.